Good morning and welcome back to Spit YouTube. Today I'm going to be talking about One Step from Eden. One Step from Eden is another deck building roguelike, and I'm going to make the bold decision to be the first person to compare it to Slay the Spire and other roguelikes. It's a game that has some very interesting design twists in the macro decision making aspect of roguelikes, which is going to form the brunt of this video's thoughts. I'll be talking about combat a little bit too, but I think Eden's most interesting features are in the decision making aspects, what, where, and some of the consequences of them. A minor thing I wish to mention before we start, I've not played Duelists of Eden, and I might one day, but it's going to have no relevance to this video. Thought number 1, deck building intricacies. One Step from Eden, like most other deck building roguelikes, does the post-combat pick one of three method of adding new cards to your deck. It's a good, solid format that provides a baseline feeling of progression and consistently makes the player think about the macro strategy of their deck. One Step from Eden also features a card rarity system, again like many other deck building roguelikes, and just like many other card games, rarer cards aren't necessarily stronger in a linear sense, but often have more interesting or difficult effects to play around with a higher reward. If you've played Slay the Spire, you can generally feel free to import the card acquisition logic of that game into One Steps. Even the logic of post-boss rare cards is in One Step. There's a few things that One Step does do quite differently though, which all feel like interesting additions to the relatively stock standard system. The first is this little section here. I have no idea what this section is actually called, so I'm just going to call it the focus setter. Each card in this game is part of a focus, think like a region from other card games, and cards with similar ideas generally fall within the same focus. Cards that have to do with poison or fragile are typically misery cards, and cards that have to do with ice, fire, and lightning are typically anima cards, etc. There's 10 of these foci, and the focus setter lets you increase the chance for cards from a certain focus to appear in card rewards. You can change these focus choices at any time, even if a given character starts with one. This focus setter is a form of RNG manipulation, and RNG manipulation of this ilk in a roguelike feels a little strange. Strange doesn't necessarily translate to bad, but it is strange to me. Part of why I like roguelikes is being forced to make the best of the hand I've been dealt, where the options presented end up being aligned with my current setup or completely unrelated from it. Being asked to choose one of three cards from a random pool feels pretty normal to me, but adding the capacity to influence what the three choice pools look like, even though both of these are just different levels of decision making, makes me feel like I'm engaging in some sort of deep-seated, perverse, underlying RNG manipulation. It feels like if I was playing Slay the Spire and was somehow allowed to increase the chance of Whirlwind or Double Tap appearing so I can more consistently attempt Ironclad speedruns, or, I don't know, giving a higher chance for Piglins to barter for Ender Pearls. I think this mechanic and feeling is really interesting though. It gets me to truly reflect on the nature of my feelings about messing around with RNG. Why does choosing which regions appear more often feel somehow wrong to me, like I'm almost mistreating the game or myself as a roguelike enjoyer, when all decisions in roguelikes are notionally about choosing things as opposed to pure unadulterated randomness? The fun of a roguelike is often about choosing the best option, and this game has just that, just both at the normal pick one of three cards level with an additional level above influencing what those three cards might end up to be. I do participate in the way Eden does it. I don't deny myself from using the focus setter mechanic, while in other games I have intentionally denied myself from using mechanics that have made me feel awkward. For example, leveling in Plants vs Zombies 2 or Lunar items in Risk of Rain 2. But every time I click these buttons, I think, man, this is strange, isn't it? Still, it's a good strange, and it definitely changes the way I view One Step as a roguelike. Another game that does this you can influence your future card choices manipulation is actually the Path of Champions from Legends of Runeterra, where if you pick a certain region for your secondary champ, you're more likely to see those regions' cards or cards that directly synergize with them. Just to show how stark it is here, I started with Gwen, a Shadow Isles champion, aka SI, and picked Jinx, a Piltover and Zorn champion, aka P&Z, as my supporting champion. Whenever I had the opportunity to add cards to my deck, my choices were an SI card and two P&Z cards, an SI card, a P&Z card, and a Bandle City card, 3 SI cards, 2 P&Z cards, and a Freljord card, 3 SI cards, 3 SI cards, 2 P&Z cards, and a Freljord card again, and 2 P&Z cards and a Noxus card. All of the cards shown also had pretty direct synergy with the cards I chose. I saw 24 choices throughout the run, and only 4 of them weren't SI and P&Z cards. But 2 of them, Bandle City and Noxus, also had pretty direct synergy with the P&Z champion as well. Both use a discard mechanic, which is directly part of Jinx's typical package. The point here is to say that a decision made early on, like which support champion package you choose, ends up really fuzzying up the card choices to be all super linked to that champion. It's one of a handful of things I strongly dislike about the Path of Champions. Maybe it's because Eden gives you a little bit more agency over this decision, while Path feels like it's defining the run for you rather than opening up options. Or maybe it's because the card pool in Path is so unbalanced and so unequal that augmenting region presentation feels like it has an enormous influence on raw strength, while Eden's difference in regions doesn't feel like it's impacting strength much. Not to get too bogged down in the weeds with this comparison, but it could also just be like a bias thing. I quite enjoy One Step from Eden. I don't have many complaints or issues with the structure of the game, but I have quite a few issues with Path of Champions, so I probably think more negatively generally about Path's mechanics and think more positively generally about Eden's. To collect ourselves back from these endless tangents, all of this is to say that the focus setter mechanic is a really stark thing in my mind about how One Step plays out. And when I think about the pantheon of all the roguelike games I've played, this is one of the first unique intricacies I think of when it comes to One Step. Every time I play it, I ask myself, man, is this RNG manipulation what I want from my roguelike? Why do I feel so weird using it? This is one of the aspects of one step that I really do want to hear what others have to say about it, especially if it ever made you feel strange using it or if I'm just overthinking things. Another thing about one step's deck building are these little markers at every 5 cards. Many deck building roguelikes have an inherent interest in having smaller decks, as it means you'll see the cards you want more consistently with less bloat of subpar cards. There are definitely reasons to have larger decks. Certain combo decks prefer certain ratios that are better accessible with bigger decks, and often games come up with synergies to incentivize bloated decks. For example, Slay the Spire's Perfectus Strike and Eternal Feather. Also from Eden also has cards and relics that incentivize larger decks such as Transmission, Deck Slam, and Deck Shield. However, even if you don't have specific synergies, this game has another innate incentive to have larger decks. For every 5 cards in your deck, up to 15 cards, you get a very slight upgrade, a 0.1 mana per second buff. In combat, you regenerate mana over time in order to cast spells, and regenerating mana quicker means more spells that can be cast, which generally correlates to more power or damage, faster battles, and an overall stronger experience. 0.1 mana per second up to 3 times 15 cards, it's not such an overpowering upgrade as to completely overshadow the strength of a very tiny, more consistent deck, but the fact that such an inbuilt system exists is really quite cool. I'm glad One Step has this incentive for medium-sized or large-sized decks. The feeling of playing a large deck where you get to spam out all your abilities, even if they're not all interlocked in their synergy because you just have such high mana regeneration, is really quite fulfilling. But it doesn't detract from the feeling on the other side of the coin, where a rather small deck with a really powerful combo can still do its thing, just with less mana regen and more time spent shuffling. And it's important to realize that shuffling your deck takes time, and the smaller the deck, the more often you'll need to shuffle. There are cards that even say do a powerful thing, but extend the time the next shuffle will take, although there are also cards that trade mana to simply reduce the next shuffle time. Unlike other card games where the primary resources to have in consideration are health, cards, and mana, One Step adds in shuffle time, which has some interesting inherent interplay with cards and mana as resources. You still regenerate mana while shuffling, but you can't spend it, and by reshuffling your deck depending on the expected quality of your cards in your discard pile compared to your draw pile, you'll increase or decrease the quality of your hand. I do want to quickly point out that Slay the Spire does try to incentivize against smaller decks in a couple ways as well, besides the cost of even getting to remove your starter cards. Both the Time Eater and Heart as bosses pressure small repetitive play decks, which is a pretty direct counter, but there's also many enemies who add statuses to your deck, making it quite a challenge if you have a 5-card deck and get even a single wound. The Heart will always have the opportunity to add statuses to your deck, and all of the Act 3 bosses add statuses to your deck. In contrast, Eden rarely has bosses augment your deck too much. There's self-added statuses in jams, with many cards that say do a powerful effect but add a jam to your deck, which is just a 2-mana card that makes you stand still for a bit but self-exhausts on play. There are bosses that technically add jams. Shizo comes to mind, but it's few and far between. The point here is to say these are 2 pretty different ways to get the player thinking about the woes of a smaller deck. Slay the Spire makes it hard to achieve it, and even if you do achieve it, it needs to be pretty airtight or you're going to struggle against some of the harder challenges, while One Step makes you think of opportunity cost and is often quite weaker due to shuffle time. The final funky deck building element that One Step from Eden has is that every card in your deck must be unique. Once you add a card to your deck, you'll likely never see it again from card rewards, unless you're in a loop. This is starkly different from the vast majority of rogue building deck likes, which not only give you multiple copies of the same underpowered cards to begin with, but offer and often encourage pluralities of the same card name, whether through direct synergies or even just because having multiple of a solid synergy card is pretty good anyway. There are still archetypes that involve multiple copies of specific tokens in Eden, say for example the cards and relics that add kunai to your deck, something very similar to Shivs from Slay the Spire, that you can't add them to your deck naturally, but many cards create tokens for them. However, you can never run 2 double takes in One Step from Eden, while Shiv decks and Slay the Spire will invariably run multiple copies of Blade Dance, Accuracy, and so forth if offered. Hell, one of the most rewarding and beloved archetypes in Slay the Spire involves the repeated addition of a singular card to your deck in Claw. Eden does away with this. While Frostbolt remains in your deck, you will not be able to add a new copy of it to your deck without deleting the first copy. You can't have a deck with just 5 Frostbolts. I should note here that this isn't strictly true, as I've only learnt from Googling. I think as the shopkeeper character, you might be able to get a second copy of a card, but in a normal game, as the main cast, it just gets taken out of the pool. This 99.9% of the time general truth ends up creating a variety of weird, intricate effects on gameplay that can get quite nuanced. The first obvious note to me is the increased value of cards like Echo, which repeat the action of the last card you played. If you've got a high value card that you'd want to play repeatedly, possibly due to its synergistic strength or the depths of upgrades on it, or even its raw power, keeping Echo to play around after that card will be quite useful. If you want to do a deck where you repeatedly play a singular card, you have to find really creative ways of replaying it, whether it's a smaller deck, perhaps incorporating shuffle time speediness in order to truly play it repeatedly, or cards like Echo. Another thing it does is add a strange twist on card removal and upgrade efficiency. Remember, it's possible to trash a card and then find it again later. Cards in One Step can be upgraded with a variety of different effects, which you upgrade via the use of these upgradeds, which cost around the same amount as a card removal. Each upgrade costs n+1 the cost of the previous, so the first upgrade on a card costs 1 upgrader, the second upgrade costs 2, etc. You can also find naturally upgraded cards in card rewards sometimes, with the likelihood of pre-applied upgrades correlating with a luck stat, which is easily accessible and increasable throughout the game. So there are theoretical worlds where you remove a starting Frostbolt from your deck that features 0 upgrades so that you can get a 2 times or 3 times upgraded Frostbolt from a card reward later on, saving you the cost and use of 3 to 6 upgraders. It's similar to the standard deck building theory of removing lower quality cards from your deck to increase the proportion of drawing higher quality cards, but it's almost like if each strike from Slay the Spire had an additional text like, when you remove me from your deck, only then can Pommel Strike be added to the pool. It's not a bad change. It can actually feel pretty rewarding to remove a low-value card from your deck, only to be able to add a version that double casts and does triple damage or something absurd to cheaply power your deck up. But it's a gameplay pattern that doesn't exist in the same way in other card games. Every card being unique also means that each focus has a set pool from which you can get all the cards from, which then gets combined with the focus setter. There are 33 cards in the Anima focus, all of a variety of different rarities. If you've taken out all of the 8 commons from the Anima focus, deleting an unupgraded common Anima card like Frostbolt can mean that it's pretty likely you'll actually see it again in the future, probably upgraded. In addition, it could be worthwhile taking cards out of the pool so that you're more likely to see the cards you want, only delete those cards towards the end now that you have the specific cards you want. All of this is baked into having this singular copy per card restriction to deck building. I think Eden makes it work, and the game definitely doesn't feel like it's missing out on that much greatness that can come from singular card name strats like Claw. Sure, that hyper-specific type of game design element is removed, but tokens like Kunai still feel like you can achieve a very similar power fantasy, and since it's so much easier to draw your deck compared to other games, it's not like you have to draw every single card, you can just press spacebar and wait a couple of seconds. Repeated play of singular powerful cards or sets of cards still feels accessible and fun. So, to recap, there's 3 major deck building changes that One Step has in comparison to the standard roguelike deck builder model. The first is the focus setter, which allows you to play around with the odds of the regions that you might see in a card reward. The second is the innate benefits of a mid to large size deck, gaining a valuable reward for every 5 cards added up to 15. And the third is card uniqueness, not allowing multiples of cards to be added to the deck. In combination, this means One Step has some competing interests that can feel quite fulfilling to play around. Medium to large decks are incentivized, but every card ends up being unique, meaning that if you want to have a large deck with a singular synergy, you'll have to get somewhat lucky, or more realistically, get creative with a lot of the cards we'll be doing, splitting ideas among multiple foci. Or strong use of the focus setter can get you into a single focus run as well, although relics, or artifacts to use the game's terminology, do not follow use of the focus setter, so it can be better open yourself up to possibilities rather than single-mindedly deciding early on what you're going to play for. This ends up being a rewarding thing to play for in most card games anyway. See some thoughts on Slay the Spire for more on that, but the tooling didn't watch is that having more than one deck-wide overarching synergy can often be beneficial, as it opens you up to having more options you're willing to take from card rewards, event shops, and other strength-increasing mechanics. I won't get too specific here, but I find that the relics and upgrades also incentivize this having 2 to 3 large-scale synergies idea strongly too. There are many relics that have this simple but strong overlap between archetypes, such as Water Wheel, making 0-cost cards such as Kunai give flow, or Delta, which makes Trinity casting grant 3 flow. Upgrades are pretty similar, sometimes being as simple as upgrade E, grant flow, or upgrade G, which gives a card a 25% chance to apply frost, etc. Card acquisition manipulation creates some really interesting questions too, with set pools where taking a card removes an option from future pools, but also being able to manipulate the pools you see, meaning that if you want to take 1 or 2 specific cards from a focus, you are slightly incentivized to take a couple extra from that focus as to thin the pool. In a given focus, there'll often be a card or 2 that innately synergizes with other foci, for example Coldstone, a Hearth card, which has upon flow, which is a largely Hearth mechanic, also casts Frostbolt, which synergizes with Anima. Overall, One Step from Eden changes up the deck building, card acquisition rules and mechanics in a way that make it feel unique in comparison to other card games of its ilk and rewarding above and beyond the actual fight and gameplay itself, while not adding so many weird and unnecessary restrictions as to feel frustrating or difficult. There are elements of it that still feel weird to play with, but it's definitely a good weird that feels both enjoyable for me to reflect on in terms of my expectations and feelings when it comes to playing a game on a personal level, but also in terms of the reasoning and consequences on a game design level. However, all of this was just one aspect of the game, and while it's definitely an interesting part of the game, it's not the only thing I've got some thoughts on. Thought number 2, floor design. I think an under-elaborated upon aspect of many roguelikes is the way they deal with flooring and mapping. I think many players take good or interesting roguelike flooring and mapping design as a given, or at least I definitely used to, but it's something I try and think about more and more as I try and compare different games. I'm going to quickly do some definitions so we're all on the same page. I know Slay the Spire uses floor to refer to each individual room since it's a spire, but to be consistent among games, and since my introduction to roguelikes was through Isaac, I'm going to refer to each thematically cohesive area, such as an act in Slay the Spire or a floor in Isaac, as a floor, and each individual instance within a floor a room. So, Slay the Spire has 3 main floors, always in the same sequence, with the rooms in each floor being relatively samey between runs, with only the order and amount of each type differing every time. There's actually a pretty limited amount of rooms in Slay the Spire. In Act 1, there's only 14 different basic enemy encounters, 3 different elite encounters, and 26 possible events. Shops are always the same in principle, and the first 3 encounters on a floor pick from the same pool of 4. Slay the Spire has a pretty rewarding floor and room system, but it's not as varied as many other games. The Binding of Isaac, on the other hand, has dozens of different floors, many of them you experience twice in a row. Specifically in the base game of Rebirth alone, there's 8. Basement, caves, depths, womb, cathedral, chest, Sheol, and the dark room. The first half also have variations, such as cellar instead of basement. With each expansion, there are tons of additional floors. There's also a myriad of individual rooms. I can't easily find a reliable looking count, but the numbers touted are something like 3,000 rooms in the base game and something like 15,000 rooms post-repentance. When you're first playing through Isaac, the possibility for rooms do feel quite vast. However, if you've got a fair bit of time in it, you inevitably have an internally set up plan for basically every room you see. I think any long-term Isaac player can probably understand me if I said the basement 2x2 room where there's 20 odd flies chasing you and each corner features a pooter and a super pooter, or or the caves room with 4 shooting heads that shoot from left to right and the set of spikes wherein you can either take the long path to go to the right, which often has a secret room, or you can do the cool strat where upon immediate entry you go to the inner spike, wait for the bullet shot, and then move forward as to easily take no damage provided you have enough movement speed to even make this path. It sounds lengthy and specific, but frankly, if you've played Isaac for like even a couple hundred hours, you've probably seen and internalized those 2 rooms and a couple thousand other rooms such that you already kind of know your general dodging patterns for the room. I remember thinking a couple hundred hours into Afterbirth Plus that the thing I wanted most in Isaac right now is not new floors, not new items, not new mechanics, but really just some new rooms to explore. And while I haven't played a lot of Repentance, one of the things that excites me the most is when I will inevitably succumb to the Isaac obsession again, is being able to experience all the new rooms. Anyway, many roguelikes can be analysed and compared by their floor and room design a lot. Whether there's a myriad of flaws like Isaac, or very few, like Slay the Spire. Do they come in the same sequential order every time, like in Isaac, and Slay the Spire, and Necrodancer, and Hades, and Tiny Rogues, and Gungeon, and Nuclear Throne? Or are they, mostly, randomized and up to player choice, like in Into the Breach, FTL, and Magicite? Room designs can also be pretty interesting. Sometimes none of it is truly randomized within the room, just the chance of getting pre-built rooms is, again, like Isaac and Slay the Spire. But sometimes the room and map design is randomly generated with some guiding principles, like in Unexplored or how I think Noita works, although I've not gotten around to playing Noita yet. One Step from Eden does some interesting things with map design. There are 4 different types of main floors: Fire, Arctic, Forest, and Ruins. And over the course of a successful run, you'll encounter each of these floors twice except one, although not necessarily one after the other, as you might expect from Isaac. You start on a random one, say Forest, and at the end of the floor after dealing with the boss, you pick one of 3 possible next floors to go to. It is a limited pool, and you'll never be offered to access a floor you've been to twice. As per the usual, each floor features slightly different regular enemies. In One Step, there are 7 floors you must travel through and complete before getting to the endgame, and thus 7 bosses. These 7 bosses are the same every time. There are 8 playable characters in the game, and the bosses you fight are simply the 7 characters you didn't choose. If you played Eden, you might turn your nose at me saying 8 characters since there's a 9th, the shopkeeper, but that's a specific exception and not even that far off, to be honest. So if you're playing as Saffron, the 7 bosses you will encounter will be Raver, Gunnar, Celacy, Hazel, Terra, Shizo, and Violet. In addition, each boss only appears in their respective zone. The Fire Zone features Saffron and Gunnar, Arctic features Celacy and Violet, Forest features Hazel and Shizo, and Ruins features Raver and Terra. Whichever character you're playing will be the one floor you skip out on. So again, if playing Saffron, you'll only go to Fire once in order to fight Gunnar. There's one additional wrinkle you need to know in order to understand the whole system and what makes it so interesting to play around with. Every couple of floors you complete makes the bosses increase a tier in difficulty. A Violet fort at the very start, who would be tier 1, is much easier than a Violet fort at the end, who would be at tier 4. The speed, pace, and scale of the attacks are very different. Take Raver for example. Here, Raver is tier 4, and her Walking Wall of Explosions attack has 2 walls and also comes with a line of purple diamonds. However, in tier 2, her Walking Wall of Explosions attack only has 1 wall, no line of purple diamonds, and is a little slower. Basically, every attack from every boss is like this. It makes choosing which floor you access super rewarding. You will fight every boss once, so it's not a matter of hoping to avoid the bloat or time eater, but more so which bosses do I think I can deal with the harder versions of, and which would I rather fight the easier versions of. For me, I generally leave Forest towards the end, as I find fully upgraded Shizo and Hazel the easiest to deal with compared to the others. Arctic is a tough one. When I'm rusty and I haven't played in a while, Celacy and Violet are really difficult, but they also feel like some of the most fun to fight, as they have the most fun dance at high levels in my IMO. And if I'm not playing a Saffron, I'll try and fight Saffron as early as possible, as I find her the single hardest boss, although if I feel deeply weak, and I believe I'll realistically get stronger faster than the scaling of the bosses, then I'll keep her for later. This approach to floor design feels pretty rewarding to me. It rewards you in knowing your own mechanical limits and current deck strength, as well as the game knowledge of which floors typically mean which boss. You can look that info up if you want, but self-discovering that there's a pattern to which bosses come from where is an incredibly rewarding feeling once you discover this. In addition, turning which boss you see from "I hope I get the easier one for my build" to "I've already overcome X hurdles and I know which Y hurdles come ahead" in a much more direct manner, as opposed to a general one, is a really cool feeling. The mapping and flooring, absent of the choice of which floor to access, is pretty samey. It's always this branching into 2 then 3 path system, with a mini-boss, shop, chest and camp, a couple of normal enemy encounters, a couple of distresses, and a couple hazards. Sometimes there are these red encounters which, upon completion, make the rest of the floor a little harder in order for some better loot and to make shops cost health instead of gold for most purchases. I think the simplicity works pretty well, but it is less varied and makes you feel like you have less choice and agency compared to something like Slay the Spire mapping. However, I think enough choice is added into other aspects of the game, particularly this choosing when to fight each boss and how difficult they'll be upon combat decision, so losing out on the same depth of choice you might have at the start of a Slay the Spire floor doesn't feel too bad. But choosing when to fight bosses is not the only other choice related to bosses you make in One Step. Thought number 3, the other boss choice. Not only do you get to choose when in your run to fight a given boss in One Step, what you do upon beating the boss is also a choice point in the game. You can make one of 2 choices upon beating a boss. You can spare them or you can slay them. Sparing them heals you a little bit and adds them to your party as an ally of sorts, which typically means every few combats from then on they'll grant you an aid specific to that boss. Hazel will build a turret for you, Saffron will cast Ragnarok, etc. Slaying them gives you some currency and XP, as well as a rare or better card reward. This choice between spare and slay also impacts the ending of your run. I think this choice point is interesting. Depending on where you're at in your Eden experience, the way the choice you make affects your gameplay is kinda cool. Early on, you don't really know the benefits one way or the other between spare and slay, as most people aren't born pre-built with knowing the ramifications of sparing or slaying bosses, at least I wasn't. But after a couple of instances, you can get the gist that slaying means more actionable rewards, currency you can spend in a higher quality card of your choice, and sparing might be more useful if you're low on health and need that pick-me-up. If you're like me, you might decide early on that clearly, sparing everyone is the right moral play. I mean, I've played Undertale, so I know exactly how video games work. But just like in Undertale, eventually you'll be curious what the differences are and try a run where you do a mix or try to slay every boss. At some point, I'm sure an enlightenment occurs, when you're playing the game not in an attempt to see what happens if we choose differently, but to play for the love of the game, making decisions in order to maximize winning chances and having to make the tough choice between a temporary heal or a permanent upgrade. Whether the specific boss's possible combat aid is beneficial to you or wasted. Personally, unless I'm trying to kill every boss, I basically always spare Raver, whose aid is probably the most beneficial, being a revive the first time you die in a run, but I'm sure it can be really complicated and interesting and super strategic play. Maybe you try and visit Shizo early, whose upgrade is to give you gold every time you visit a rest site so they can get extra currency as the game goes on. I'll also quickly put here that I'm glad there's a little bit of banter between the bosses. It's not a lot and there's no voice acting or anything, but it's just enough to be a bit of fun. Thought number 4, battles as instinct and battles as puzzles. I spent the brunt of this video talking about the game's decision-making aspects when presented with decision-making menus, either through literal pick one of 3 screens or the time pause decision points like slaying versus killing a boss. But this game also has like a whole combat system as well. You play on this 4x8 map where you can move on the left side and the enemy gamers can move on the right side. Some abilities allow you to temporarily move to the other side, primarily slash-fic abilities and one of the Celicy kits. Sometimes battles are only about dodging enemy attack patterns and sliding into your own attacks, nothing more, nothing less. Sometimes you might have cards that you want to play because they have a permanent effect. Oftentimes there's this upgrade you can find on cards saying consume me to give yourself max HP, or healing cards, or some cards that give you money if that card itself slays an enemy gamer, like Feed or Hand of Greed and Slay the Spire. But combats can have even more than that. Sometimes in regular combats you find these hostages, friendly units on the opposite side of the board that, should they be kept alive by the time all the enemy gamers are defeated, can give you HP or currency. Some rooms are simple enough and sometimes you have a simple enough kit that there's no worry they would be caught in the crossfire, but sometimes you really need to consider all the ways your build does damage and spend a fair bit of time dodging just in order to keep the hostage alive. Hostages aren't the only things you want to avoid hitting in combat, namely the quarantine, which summons a quarreling when destroyed, which is a particularly feisty and irritating enemy that you don't actually have to deal with if you simply don't destroy the quarantine box. There's also sometimes self-defense turrets which hit you for a lot if you mindlessly hit them. When rooms feel like this, that the better play is to simply dodge the remaining enemy's attacks in order to grant yourself a better reward from the fight, makes the room almost feel like a puzzle where you need to find a specific, quite nuanced and developed method of finding lethal. And while I do enjoy the instinctual, fast-paced, I need to kill all the enemy gamers ASAP because the more time I spend in this room, the more likely I am to start taking damage part of the game, I really do enjoy how seamlessly Eden finds itself back into these more puzzle-feeling rooms and environments. I think some people find it strange when I say, for example, that Risk of Rain 2 can actually be a pretty relaxing game with all its constant action and constant movement, but at a certain point in your run, you sort of just get used to your kit and the way to dodge enemies that you get into a bit of a flow state. Eden does the same thing with these rooms where there's only 1 to 2 enemies left. Whether there's a hostage to save or a quarantine to avoid breaking, you just relax and think about the best way to solve the puzzle. There are also more obvious puzzles, almost like events in the game in the form of distress beacons, a hostage or two next to a thing that is guaranteed to kill them, and you're asked, how do you choose to deal with this situation? Sometimes you can't, based on your hand, and you just have to let the hostage die. Sometimes you can choose to stand in front of the bullet, or choose to move the gun or the hostage with some moving cards, or sometimes you can burst down the threat. These puzzle rooms / events are neat, but they're not as rewarding as the puzzle rooms that feature regular enemies whom you have to dodge in their regular patterns, while also trying to figure out how to safely navigate the situation. Moments in action roguelikes where you can safely dodge the enemy gamers and it's beneficial to spend some time thinking on how to min-max the resources can be a really great part of action roguelikes. Conclusion. I quite like One Step from Eden, but not really for one particular reason. I really like it as a deck-building roguelike, as a lot of the deck-building decisions really feel unique compared to games like Slay the Spire, Monster Train, and Path. The focus setter and 1-card restriction plus the upgrade system feels rewarding, and it also tickles my brain something funky when I try and think of the system as a whole. But then I really enjoy the gameplay, not purely because it's some high-octane action game where you always need to be thinking on your toes, but because of the sort of puzzly flow state it finds itself into. And then I really enjoy the macro-level decision-making, which is baked into so many separate aspects of the game, but in particular the floor selection and the slay versus save choices, which feel unique to the game and rewarding to ponder over. Feels like it allows for deep strategizing as well as a fair amount of personalization. There's a couple of odd knickknacks I wanted to mention that I couldn't fit anywhere else that I would feel really remiss if I didn't mention even a little bit. The shops in Eden are pretty cool. I'm particularly a big fan of the pact system, a temporary downside during the next 1 to 3 fights for a boon, or some instant pain for some instant gain. I think weapons are a perfect way to make each character feel super unique and are a great aspect of this game, and that it lets starter cards just be cards in the game accessible by all characters, unlike say in Slay the Spire where Bash or Survivor is character specific. I think luck works pretty well as a mechanic overall. I think the upgrading system is pretty enjoyable to participate in, even if a lot of the time time, it does feel like the same stuff is clearly the best, at least to me. I didn't mention music and art style. They're both pretty good. They're not uniquely up my alley, but there are definitely some banging tunes, and I love the piano and strings especially. So overall, I quite like this game. I think it presents itself as unassuming and a bit simple, and I don't think it generates nearly enough buzz compared to other roguelikes, and that makes me kind of sad, as there's a lot of charm to this game. Just a few more things to wrap up before the video ends. I haven't fully completed all that I want to from Eden, unlike Slay the Spire, where I felt like I've completed most of what I wanted to complete. I've not actually beaten one of the endings yet, and I've only gone so far as to loop once, although as far as I know, I've beaten every other ending multiple times. In addition, I've not completed every hell level yet, think like Ascensions, nor have I won with every character yet, so I definitely like to square those away at some point if other games don't end up taking up all my time. Finally, I'm on uni break again, so there'll be more Spids YouTube in the next couple of months. That's all. See you later, alligators.